My name is Jim Lough. I'm a lifelong experiencer that sometimes I can't tell what's paranormal and what is sort of experience or abduction related. These kinds of experiences started when I was very young. My first experience I remember was when I was 5.5 years old, the weekend before kindergarten started. We were out in the country at a place that my family and my uncle's family were building, what they were called a clubhouse back in Missouri. And we were sitting out there, and I was sort of annoying the adults, and so they put me on looking for Sputnik in the sky, because this was just right after Sputnik had been launched, creating a big fervor. And so I'm looking up in the sky, and I notice over a pasture that's about 500 to 1,000 feet away from us, there was this object that just all of a sudden appeared, and it was about the size of a full moon, but it was very bright, and it appeared to have metal dripping off of it. And yet the field was dry because it was late summer and nothing was catching on fire. And I'm just amazed by it, watching it. And then I want to see whether my family is looking at it too, my uncle and his kids and wife and my dad. And so I look up at them, and they just all, you can see the light reflecting off their faces, and their mouths are just wide open, and they're just blank staring at it. And that's the last thing I remember. And the next morning, I wake up, go out to the campfire in the same spot we were before, and they were having coffee and cigarettes and just sitting around talking about the comet they had seen. And so, being 5.5 years old, I thought comets came down from the sky over pastures, looking like a full moon that was right there. And so later in life, it sort of conflicted with what I learned about in science, but I always thought that. So the next day was the start of kindergarten, and I'm talking to my dad about the comet. And he looks at me and says, "What comet?" "No, the one we saw out at the place." And he goes, "I have no idea what you're talking about. We didn't see a comet." And so I stopped talking about it, and I just went back to thinking about starting kindergarten and was excited about that. And so I never really shook, at least while I was younger, that the fact comets were as big as a full moon and would fly around. As I got a little older, in my grade school years, like fourth to about 7th or 8th grade, I had sort of a sleepwalking period where many times my parents would find me outside, or one time I was outside and the door was locked, and how I got out on the other side, we all sort of just glossed over that. They took me to a doctor about it, and he said, "Don't worry, it'll pass." And lots of kids sleepwalk. So eventually I stopped sleepwalking. But when I was 17, in April of that year, I was playing basketball at a neighbor's house, and we were playing in the backyard for about 2 hours. And I was walking home, and I decided, instead of turning down my street and going home, it was about 9:30, 10 o'clock, I decided to go lay in the park. And so I walked down to the local park, but the funny thing about it is they were just planting grass in it, and it was peat moss all over the top of grass shoots shooting up. And I laid down in that in my sweaty high school gym outfit that I'd been playing basketball in, and started watching the sky. And I'm sweaty, and I've got this stuff all stuck in me, but it didn't matter. I was watching the sky, and I was looking a direction towards a regional airport that is closed at night. And I saw an object that started flying. I lived in San Dimas at the time, and it was flying from east to west towards Los Angeles. And I couldn't see the object itself. What I could see was an outline of a lenticular-shaped object that, even though the sky was black and dark, starlit, and no clouds, this was much dark. It was like the absence of light. And so it just kept going along at a fairly slow pace. With the foothills behind it, I knew that it was no more than 4 or 5 miles away. And I'm going, that's not an airplane, because I could hear it, because it was dead silent. You couldn't hear anything, not a cricket or anything. So it can't be an airplane, it can't be a helicopter. And so it just kept gliding along, and it was starting to leave my field of vision. And I thought to myself, it must be a UFO. I didn't say it out loud, I just in my head said that. And about the letter F in UFO, it just all of a sudden took a right-angled turn, about 130 degrees, and started coming straight towards me on an angle, straight downward, because it was probably at 3,000 feet or so, and it was coming down to ground level. And I was just amazed. I lost it for a second while I was reaching down for a rock, because I thought, this is going to come right over my head. And I wanted to have a rock to see if it was coming close, I could hit it. And so when it started getting close, I threw the rock straight up, hoping to hit it. I didn't hit it, and the rock came right down, nearly grazed my head. And yet I just, mouth open, just kept staring at it. And if it was at 75 feet, my guess it would have been about perfectly circular from the bottom object that was about 30 feet across. If it was higher, it was probably 40 feet across. But on the bottom, it was just perfectly circular shaped. From the side, it was lenticular. So in other words, it was a classic UFO. As it approaches me, it starts going up another direction. And from my perspective, I thought it was going straight up behind me and up towards the San Diego Mountains and then over the mountains. It passed over a water reservoir, and I knew where that was. And so it was a good frame of reference. I could tell it was going over the city of Glendora at the time. And it just kept on its same path. It seemed to me to never vary speed, even though it changed its directions. And then it finally disappeared. About 40 years later, 50 years later, I had joined the Close Encounters Resource Organization, and Yvonne Smith, the leader of the group, regressed me. And so I went through a regression on this incident as to see whether or not I had been abducted. And nothing came out in the regression of note, but I saw things that I remembered much clearer. And so after the regression, it was in the La Cañada area. I drove back to San Dimas on my way back home in San Diego and went to the park and go, there's something wrong about what my memory is. And then when I stood at the spot, roughly where I saw the object, I realized that the water reservoir was to my right. And it didn't go, if the object went straight behind me, it couldn't have gone over the reservoir. So then I realized, having talked to other people who had had these kinds of experiences, that sometimes when they put you back, they don't put you back exactly where you are facing. And some people end up with their clothes on backwards or wearing a t-shirt that they don't own, that kind of thing. But it clearly showed me it may not prove it to anyone else, but it did to me, that I was facing one direction 1 millisecond, and the next millisecond I was facing another direction. So it corroborated for me the kinds of experiences many of the friends that I had met in Cerro. So with that kind of experience, it was really hard to tell myself that it wasn't sleep apnea, it wasn't any other excuse, because this happened when I was totally awake. And so after that experience, probably through my early 40s, I had a series of intrusive experiences. I would have them mixed in with other paranormal experiences, as if I was opening up to other things because of my abduction experiences. During that time, I would try to deny that it was going on, especially in my late 30s. But things kept happening around me. I started checking things like marks on my body, and I would tend to be agitated if I was going to be taken that night. And so it's like I knew ahead of time, and would lay down, even though I had to go to work, and I was the city attorney of Fresno at the time, had to get up in the morning and be on. I didn't want to go to sleep. And so I started having lots of other experiences that sort of explained to me what was going on when I was asleep, or whenever I would have these kinds of missing time blackouts. One experience that really unnerved me is I had been having a series of experiences, and I knew I was having something happen. And I went out for a walk, probably 9 o'clock at night, and walked through the subdivision. And my subdivision, had normal street lights. And one time I counted, I had 20 different street lights. When I walked under it would go off, and as soon as I would get about 30 feet away, it would go back on. And when this happens 20 times in a row, it's not random chance. And so these kinds of experiences would help me. Another one was more paranormal that sort of convinced me that I was opened up to other things besides that, is we had just returned from my father-in-law's funeral. He passed away in 1991 of early onset Alzheimer's. And the family was really shook by it, because when he passed away, in advanced Alzheimer's, there's no memory, and it's quite crushing on the family. And so we were all worried, those of us that believed in an afterlife were worried about him. Is he going to be like that? And so it was the end of the week after I'd come home from the funeral, and my wife and 2 kids came out to greet me when I drove in, and we decided to play basketball. We had a basketball hoop in the driveway. And so we're playing basketball, girls against boys, a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old, a 6-year-old boy. And my young son started getting mad because he accused me of letting the girls win. And it was very upsetting to him. So he sort of stopped off to the side of the house for a second. And I look over behind him, and just all of a sudden a 3-dimensional apparition appeared that was probably 4 to 5 feet wide and about 3 feet tall. It was sort of oval, but it had depth to it. And it looked like if you stick your hand in a swimming pool in the summer and wave it around, how you get that swirling motion in the sunlight, reflecting. It looked like it was filled with that kind of material, just swirling and different light reflections. And when I looked at it, the first thing that popped into my head was, that's Harold. He's okay. And so after it disappeared, I had lost total interest in playing basketball, whether the girls won or the boys. And so I said, let's all go in the house. So we opened the garage door and started going in the house. And once we got in, we realized all the lights were out. So I went back into the garage, and our fuse box was right within 4 or 5 feet of where that apparition showed up. And I had to reset every breaker. Every single one of them had gone off. And so the next morning I was out doing yard work, and my next door neighbor on that side, who we seldom talked to, was a very nice person, but they were on a different street because we were on a corner, so we didn't know them that well. And so I asked him how he was doing, and he said, not too well. They have a real problem with their electricity. And right there on the outside of the wall, next to where that apparition appeared, that electrical kind of disturbance, was their breakers panel. And he said that it was the darndest thing that their entire breaker panel, all the fuses melted, every single one of them, and the electricians were going to have to replace the entire breaker panel. And so they were out without electricity, and so they were going to go stay in a hotel. So I didn't tell him. I think it was my father-in-law, returning from the dead to tell me he was okay. I didn't, being the city attorney at the time, I didn't think that would be the kind of thing I would want spread in the community, so I didn't say anything. But since that point, in the last maybe 15 years or so, it's been hard for me to tell sometimes whether things are paranormal or, sort of ET, non-terrestrial related. And so I've had a lot of experiences, but they sort of changed over time. And I sort of got comfortable with what I was going through, and sort of saw that I became sort of mission driven. I had planned when I retired to write a book on California election law. And instead of writing that book, I changed and decided to write a book on UFOs. It was right after, on my 65th birthday, the New York Times and Politico released the 3 Navy videos. And it was like a switch went off in my head. I dropped all pretense of doing an election law book and started writing a book on how Congress should handle disclosure. And it was called the UFO Briefing Book, Congressional Guide to the UAP Phenomena. And I wrote it before the Senate Intelligence Committee received the first UAP report from the intelligence community. And so in writing the book, I wanted to tell members of Congress that you're not going to get much help from them, and here's the kind of steps you need to take. I wasn't worried about making money off it. In fact, I never even made a Kindle version of it. What I did is I sent 200 copies to Congress and listed things like they needed to disclose non-disclosure agreements, they needed to adopt whistleblower protections, and they needed to look at the history of the phenomena to see what's been hidden behind closed doors. And so that got to them before they started writing legislation. And whether coincidental or not, it parroted a lot of what they did in the next 3 years of their legislation. I followed up that with a book called Threat to the Body Politic, Foo Fighters to UAP. And that's more about the historical programs in government and Congress's non-involvement with the decision making and how they need to be involved. And so my main pitch to them, this book I'm not as concerned about selling as getting them to understand what they're dealing with, is that disclosure is going to happen. We're going to know. And there's a lot more to it than just tin cans flying around in the sky. There's a spiritual component too. And also not that they're angels or demons, but that there's going to be a shift in consciousness in some way or respect. And that we need to have more than just the typical partisan fighting. And so I in thousands of letters I've written, copies to many Congress members, I've always talked about how this needs to be nonpartisan. That if this is partisan at all, it's going to create more chaos. But if they approach it in a careful manner and reveal what's behind the curtains in a responsible way, that transition's going to be a lot easier. And so that's been my goal all along. And so, as Yvonne Smith said, when you may not know that you have a mission, but when you know you have a mission, let me put it this way, you know you have a mission, but you don't know what it is. But when the time comes, you'll know. And instantly, when in 2017, on my 65th birthday, I knew that what I was supposed to do. And I put out the first book in 5 months. And the second one took longer, but I knew what I was doing and why I was doing it. And it wasn't to influence them that UFOs are real or not, but it was to have them understand is if we start going down this path, you're going to have to do it together, because we can't have a society where some people believe and some people don't. Because when those people that don't believe start having sightings or things start happening, they're not going to know how to handle it. And they deserve better.